Avatio est. Enigma cuderitas est.
Welcome back, my fellow seekers. Atlantis. I have covered this topic in a few of my other biblical enigma videos. Too many people look at this legend in the wrong way. Just as evangelicals will take the Bible too literal, so too will New Agers like Jimmy from Bight Insight when it comes to these epics. We have to look at these stories more logically through an anthropological view, such as Dr. Michael S. Heiser's research on these epics. But YouTubers like Bight Insight have a limited logical view when coming up with ideas on Atlantis. But he was able to shift his view instead of following the traditional view on Atlantis. So I applaud him for that, but still his logical conclusion falls short. However, I do think Jimmy is right. Atlantis is hidden in plain sight. So I'm not going to try to debunk Jimmy's idea of the Ricat structure being Atlantis, because there's plenty of sources starting on Wikipedia that will lead you to direct sources, and this is more than enough information to say that it's a natural feature. And as a landscape architect, I just cannot accept his idea that this would be a place where you would build civilization, for which even Jimmy can't deny. He then goes on to say in part 2 of his video of Atlantis,
Now, the most common response I received in my prior video regarding the Ricat structure being a possible location of Atlantis were comments that said something to the effect of, the Ricat is a natural formation, so no, it cannot be Atlantis. But why would the Ricat structure being a natural formation exclude it from being Atlantis? If anything, being a natural formation would further support the possibility that it is Atlantis.
Jimmy! Jimmy! No!
You just had to push the desperate logic button, didn't you, Jimmy? You know, that's like saying when you see a mountain that looks like a pyramid, but you know it's a mountain, but you still want to say it's man-made. So then you go on to say, well, it was carved by man, in order to save on time and effort in making a real pyramid. We don't need to make a real pyramid. Or like when you see a cloud that looks like a UFO, and you want to believe it's a UFO, so you say, oh, that's a UFO disguised as a cloud, or there's a UFO inside the cloud. So that's why we can't see the UFO. But when you're talking about a large city-state, wouldn't there be material evidence on top of the natural features like you show in your examples? But then you go on to argue, oh, well, that's because all the evidence was wiped out by a mega tsunami and great flood covering most of the Sahara Desert due to the Younger Dryas impact theory from the Atlantic, which explains the striations on the Sahara Desert, and this completely wiped out all traces of the civilization, even granite foundations. Thank you, Alita, for expressing my emotions for me. No is correct, because those striation dunes are formed from east to west off the jet stream flow of the northeast Hammer-Alton trade winds. Yeah, it's caused by wind, not water. So you're going to need something like the KT impact to cause water to flow that far inland, because we're talking about a surface area larger than the mainland US. Also, not even a mega tsunami will be able to disintegrate all traces of granite foundation, and that is the signature material for advanced civilization, megalithic architecture. But Jimmy is right, Atlantis could be hiding in plain sight, and I think he is on the right continent, but we're not referring to the lost continent aspect of the story, but the lost city-state. The lost continent is simply probably a reference to North and South America. Based on the old maps of those days, there was some hint by the pre-Celtics and the Vikings and the Egyptians that there was some lost land beyond the gates of Hercules, and that must have been simply North and South America. Back then, the world was a lot smaller. As they discovered more, they realized it was a lot larger. So what we might have here is simply a compilation of at least 2 stories put together into one by the time Plato received it, the lost continent aspect and the lost city-state. And there is a far more plausible conclusion on why we can't find this large city-state. Because what is more destructive than a natural disaster and time? Well, as a landscape architect, I would say people. The place where this legend came out of was from Egypt by Sontius of Sais. And a logical place where a lost city-state could be is on a river. So I would hypothesize the real Atlantis, not a name, because names change, but in a collective memory would be coming out of Cairo, Egypt. So I think this is the most logical place for the birth of this legend, as well as the birth of the legend of the Garden of Eden, being the Nile Delta, for which I made a whole documentary review video you'll need to check out. I do subscribe to the hypothesis promoted by Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, and Brian Forster, and others who have been promoting that Egypt could be far older than we ever imagined. Cairo is considered to be one of the oldest cities in the world, going back to the ancient Egyptian city of Memphis, at least 2000 BC. Cairo's official name is Al-Qahira, which means literally place or camp of Mars, in reference to the fact that the planet was rising at the time of the city's foundation, as well as the referred to as the Vanquisher, or the Conqueror, the Victorious, or the Strong, Al-Qahira, in reference to the much awaited Caliph of Al-Muzi Liden Allah, who arrived from the old Fatima capital of Mahdiya in 973 AD. The Victorious is often quoted as being the most popular meaning of the name Cairo. The Egyptian name for Cairo is also said to be Ka'arehoe, meaning the place of combat, supposedly in reference to the battle which took place between the god of Seth and Horus. Biblically, this could also refer to when the angels were coming down, and there was a turmoil period, with something supernatural manifesting to mankind. And Egypt could be the place where the supernatural first manifested. Sometimes the city is informally referred to as Cairo. It is also called al-Dunya, meaning the mother of the world, which also has a connection to the name origin of Africa or Afrafrica, meaning mother of mankind, which could also be interpreted as the birthplace of civilization. Now, there are some clues we can take from Plato, but you do have to cherry pick to what makes the most logical sense in the context of the limited knowledge of Plato's world back then and to what we know now. So one clue that is probably the most important is the mention that there was a great number of elephants on the island. Again, Plato may be conflicting two legends, so island should not be taken too literal. We know that there are elephants in Africa, and some have been utilized along the Nile. So if elephants was the original observation, then Africa must be the place where the lost city-state came from. Also, Plato hints that the surrounding mountains of the city flowed with rivers. Again, mountains may be a description for the lost continent aspect of the legend. And rivers could be a reference to where the lost city-state was located along. And the Nile actually branches into smaller rivers, into the Garden Delta. Plato also hints that the main city of Atlantis consists of centric circles of water and land. Now, the Egyptian hieroglyph for city is actually a circle with an X. Another clue Plato states is that there was abundance of metal, copper, and gold. Now, I don't think it's logical to think he's just referring to quarry sites, but actual goods made with metal. But if he was referring to actual regions rich in metallic resources, then the easiest place to extract metallic minerals would be along a river. And the Nile was very rich in raw resources where many goods were made and distributed all over the Middle East and beyond. Also, many of the techniques of metallurgy that the Greeks and the Persians picked up actually came from the Egyptian region and the Sumerians, which was improved upon. For example, the legendary Damascus steel was actually not forged in Damascus. Only the pattern welding steel was made around Syria, for which was part of the Egyptian world order over 2000 BC. But steel may not last that long, and it was mostly the elites that had steel, and no doubt they would have recycled many of the materials. But the pattern welding steel was actually just the aesthetic invention, not the original crucible making of flexible, strong steel, through layering techniques and additive recipe materials into the steel. That came out of Persia and was passed down to India, and possibly that knowledge could have been passed down to the Mongols, who in turn the Japanese may have picked it up from. But the Japanese greatly refined the steel. But where the original metallurgy techniques came from before the Persians is a mystery, but I would bet the original techniques of crucible steel came from Egypt. but that technology was lost to Egypt but later adopted by the Persians. And it was the Persians who were the last to inherit ancient Egyptian culture, for which we can see in the architecture of Persepolis. Another clue Plato gives us is the country immediately surrounding the city of Atlantis was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains which descend towards the sea. The plain was smooth and even. This part of the island looked towards the south and was sheltered from the north. Now, Cairo sits at the entrance of the Garden Delta plain, juxtaposed by not mountains but plateaus. Plato may have used the word mountains as a reference to the region he lived in, or maybe it was simply the last description of the lost continent aspect of the story. The Nile Delta plain was sheltered from the north, but keep in mind, back in those days, the lodestone was used, so north was actually south. So the plateaus were on either side of the Nile entrance to the plain of the Delta, which descends towards the Mediterranean Sea. The Garden of Eden, aka the Delta, was a smooth and even plain. At the entrance of the garden was the lost city-state, where Cairo is located, surrounded by plateaus on either side of the Nile, which was north to them, but south to us. Now I think the biggest clue that Plato gives us is when he says, there were alternative zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which were churned as if with a lathe, each having its circumference equidistant every way from the center. Now this sounds like a palace canal moat system layout, similar to Angkor Wat, but circular instead of rectangular. If it were rectangular, it would have lasted longer. But if this was the first city-state palace system that was built over 12,000 years ago, then yeah, it would have been almost totally destroyed, especially if it was on a river, by natural disasters, and with a large population for over thousands of years, people would eventually recycled almost all the materials. Now, not all the materials would have been completely gone, but simply converted into new bricks, new limestone blocks cut down to smaller pieces for new buildings, and new configurations of a city master plan layout, depending on which pharaohs wanted what. And most of the building structures would have been more mud brick and limestone. Only the monuments would have been made out of granite, for which we do find some underneath Cairo. I think some of the limestone evidence in modern-day Cairo could be remnants of the real lost city-state. We might also call Shambhala or Agartha the center of the world in the perspective of the people at the time. The evidence could be right in front of us. If there ever was a civilization that could reshape a river, it would have been the Egyptians, for there is evidence that for a long time the art of canal shaping was common in Egypt over its delta. It sounds like this was a master plan layout of a city-state palace system like Angkor Wat. So the place where you could make canals for ports and a navy to protect the palace would have been along a river. I think if you were to combine the layout of Tenochtitlan and Angkor Wat in a circular canal system, that is what Atlantis would have looked like. Atlantis may have been ahead of its time, but being located on a river is not the best place if you want a city-state to last long. It would have been a very high-maintenance kind of place, and the slightest political turmoil could put a stop to that maintenance, and the river over time would go back to its normal form, eroding almost all evidence of a circular canal system. Plato also references that Atlantis, the city-state, was part of the Atlantic, which is now no longer accessible by ship. Atlantis, when sunk by the earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing hence to any part of the ocean. Now looking at this through the lost city-state aspect of the legend, ocean should be replaced with sea. If a major earthquake and tsunami happened in the Nile Delta, added with an abnormal monsoon event due to the Younger Dryas impact theory, then yeah, it would have caused major liquefaction blocking up the Nile and preventing any ships from getting out of the Cairo region to the Mediterranean. And this would have flooded the entrance of the Garden of Eden and possibly the whole delta. Any large megalithic blocks would have been sunk into the liquefied mud of the Nile Delta entrance. Also, there is evidence of megalithic ruins off the coast of the Nile Delta, and this might just be the tip of the iceberg of what we could find under the Garden of Atlantis. So yeah, I believe the most logical place for the real Atlantis is Egypt. It has always been the civilization that has inspired the romanticization of this legend. What do you think of this hypothesis? Does this sound more logical than what Jimmy is presenting? If you agree with this hypothesis, Share this video to Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, and others who write on prehistory, and check out my other biblical enigma videos. This has been Enigma Seeker. Keep seeking those enigmas.
Enigma de Pravatio